Okay, let's dive right into this intellectual detective story. Today, we're unpacking a really thought-provoking review of Norman L. Geisler's book, Biblical Errancy, an analysis of its philosophical roots. We're going to trace the true origins of the idea that the Bible contains historical or scientific errors and figure out exactly where those doubts actually came from. Think about it for a second. When people question the historical or factual accuracy of the Bible today, what do we usually assume drove that skepticism? Well, we usually assume it's because of new, hard evidence, right? Like some groundbreaking scientific breakthrough or a newly unearthed archaeological discovery that somehow challenged the biblical record. But is that actually the whole story? The core conflict here is absolutely fascinating. Geisler's book argues something completely different from what we normally assume. He says it wasn't empirical evidence or new data that killed the idea of biblical inerrancy. No, it was actually an influx of alien philosophical presuppositions. Basically, theologians started importing anti-supernatural ideas from modern Western thought, and that totally changed how they read the text. To understand how this all unfolded, we'll break this down into 4 parts: a philosophical diagnosis, the modern philosophy suspects, the theological fallout, and finally, evaluating the apologetic. Let's start with part 1, a philosophical diagnosis, where we build the premise. Geisler approaches this denial of inerrancy exactly like a medical doctor diagnosing a disease. In his view, modern Western philosophy is the underlying illness, and the claim that the Bible has errors, the inerrancy, is really just the symptom. Before you can even try to construct a defense of the Bible, you first have to properly diagnose the philosophical virus that's infected modern theology. So, the crucial point he makes right out of the gate changes the entire debate. He says the denial of biblical inerrancy is not primarily a factual problem, it's a philosophical one. The argument here is that if we actively identify and reject these anti-supernatural assumptions, all those evidential arguments against the Bible suddenly lose their punch. It's not about the data, it's all about the lens through which you're viewing that data. Moving to part 2, the modern philosophy suspects of the modern era. The book takes us on a sweeping chronological journey, century by century. It starts with 17th century thinkers like Bacon and Hobbes introducing strict materialism. Then it moves right through the skepticism of the 18th century, into the transcendentalism of the 19th century, and all the way up to 20th century process theology. It's a look at how each era's prevailing thoughts progressively chipped away at biblical revelation. You can draw a direct, tangible line from specific intellectual frameworks to their theological consequences. For example, David Hume's strict empiricism leads directly to the outright rejection of miracles. Immanuel Kant's separation of the knowable world from the unknowable makes the very idea of God giving us propositional truths seem completely incoherent. And Hegel's transcendentalism, well, that basically makes actual historical events inferior to abstract spiritual truths. Let's zoom in on one of these suspects for a moment. The review specifically praises Gary Habermas's chapter on David Hume as a total masterclass in philosophical apologetics. Habermas completely dismantles Hume's circular reasoning, pointing out that Hume basically defines miracles as impossible from the very start, and then, get this, uses the resulting absence of miracles to prove he was right all along. It's an assumed bias, not an actual scientific conclusion. But perhaps the most influential suspect of all comes way back from the 17th century, Benedict Spinoza. Geisler demonstrates how Spinoza's presuppositions, like his geometric rationalism and his anti-supernatural reading of narratives, were just light years ahead of his time. Spinoza's philosophical framework actually drove virtually every major move of 19th century liberal biblical criticism. Those 19th century scholars hadn't found new evidence, they were literally just applying Spinoza's philosophy. Which brings us to part 3. The theological fallout, because ideas definitely have consequences. The review points out that 20th century process theology represents the most explicit challenge here. Process theology essentially argues that God is finite and constantly changing right alongside the universe. Well, if you adopt that philosophy, having an unchanging, inerrant Bible makes absolutely no sense. A changing truth about a changing God just can't be permanently fixed in a static text. And this isn't just some abstract problem limited to distant secular academics. The book's epilogue provides a highly practical, applied analysis showing how specific contemporary evangelical scholars, folks like Berkouwer, Rogers, Davis, and Pinnock, actually adopted errantist positions precisely because of these philosophical drifts. The review specifically praises Geisler for his fairness here. Take Jack Rogers, for instance. Geisler totally acknowledges Roger's scholarly seriousness and his genuinely good intentions. But he separates those good intentions from the highly destructive logical implications of the philosophers Rogers was relying on, heavyweights like Kant, Heidegger, and Wittgenstein. And when it comes to theologian Clark Pinnock, Geisler actually outlines a staggering 23-point summary. It meticulously traces how Pinnock progressively accepted the very same philosophical premises that the earlier chapters identified as highly corrosive to biblical inerrancy. It is literally a step-by-step roadmap of theological drift. Finally, let's wrap up with part 4, evaluating the apologetic. What are the strengths and blind spots? The reviewer establishes that the book has massive enduring strengths. Its strict commitment to tracing specific philosophical genealogies prevents the lazy oversimplification of just blaming secular influence for everything. It functions as a durable diagnostic tool, helping us understand exactly why otherwise orthodox theologians sometimes drift toward these errantist positions. However, the review does note a pretty major vulnerability. The entire book relies heavily on the 1978 Chicago Statement on Biblical Inerrancy. Geisler actually helped frame this statement, and he uses it as his ultimate standard. The problem? He uses it as an unargued benchmark. He just assumes it's the default position without ever defending it against critiques from within the evangelical camp. So the reviewer points out a really fascinating methodological inconsistency. Geisler aggressively and brilliantly analyzes the philosophical context of those who deny inerrancy, but his blind spot is that he completely shields his own tradition from that exact same scrutiny. He never stops to examine the philosophical depths of his own old Princeton framework. On top of that, the reviewer notes a few other weaknesses. The book tends to dismiss genuine textual concerns, like how the Old Testament uses earlier sources, as merely being philosophically generated. By doing that, it completely sidesteps the strongest arguments of nuanced, non-inerrantist evangelicals. It also totally ignores how early church fathers like Augustine approached the text. This leaves you with the false impression that Geisler's highly specific modern version of inerrancy was the historical consensus from day one. As we wrap up this explainer, we really have to turn the lens back on ourselves. Geisler masterfully showed how unseen philosophy dictates how scholars read the Bible. But what about us? Are we interpreting the world, history, or sacred texts based on pure evidence? Or are hidden philosophical frameworks pulling the strings in our own minds? It is definitely a question worth exploring. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.